Hey everyone, welcome back to your daily dose of what's hot on Hacker News. Yesterday was one of those days where the front page perfectly captured everything I love about this community, from mind-blowing hardware hacks to philosophical debates about the future of computing, and even a moment to reflect on the giants whose shoulders we stand on. Out of the 30 stories that crossed my desk yesterday, 3 really stood out and dominated the discussion boards. We've got an absolutely bonkers business card that's running fluid physics simulations. Yes, you heard that right. We'll dive into the great cloud versus local AI debate that's splitting the tech community right down the middle. And we'll take a moment to honor a true space pioneer whose passing reminds us of when humanity dared to do the impossible. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. All right, so shifting gears from software to something you can actually hold in your hand, let's talk about Ultrathin business card runs a fluid simulation. And yes, you heard that right. Someone built a business card that's essentially running physics simulations in real time. And the Hacker News crowd is absolutely eating this up with over 1,000 points. So picture this. You're at a networking event, someone asks for your business card, and instead of handing them a piece of cardstock with your LinkedIn URL, you pull out this ultra-thin PCB that's literally simulating fluid dynamics right there in their hand. This developer has created what might be the most over-engineered business card I've ever seen. And I mean that in the best way possible. The technical achievement here is genuinely impressive. They're running a flip simulation, that's fluid implicit particle physics, on an RP2350 microcontroller. Now, if you've ever tried to run fluid simulations, you know they're computationally expensive. We're talking about calculations that typically bring gaming PCs to their knees, and this person's doing it on hardware that fits in your wallet. The whole thing is powered by a rechargeable battery, and here's a neat detail. They've implemented this board edge USB-C charging port. No bulky connector sticking out, the edge of the PCB itself becomes the port. That's some clever engineering borrowed from another maker named Cianlore. What I find fascinating is that the developer wrote the fluid simulation logic as a standalone Rust crate. They based it on work from this YouTube channel called 10-Minute Physics by Matthias Müller, which, if you haven't checked out, does these brilliant breakdowns of complex physics algorithms. So we're seeing this beautiful chain of knowledge sharing, from YouTube educational content to Rust libraries to physical hardware you can hand someone at a conference. Now, the Hacker News discussion around this is really interesting because it perfectly captures this tension in the maker community. On one hand, you've got people who are just blown away by the technical achievement. Like, yes, this is completely impractical as an actual business card. One commenter pointed out, it probably costs $30 to $50 per unit, and you definitely want it back after showing it to someone. But that's kind of missing the point, right? This falls into what some folks are calling computational jewelry, these electronic art pieces that showcase engineering skills in a way that no resume ever could. Imagine being a hiring manager and someone hands you this. You're not just reading about their skills, you're literally holding a demonstration of their PCB design abilities, their embedded programming chops, their understanding of physics algorithms, all in this impossibly thin form factor. Though I have to mention, because the creator's actually in the comments asking for feedback, apparently the typography choices are, let's say, controversial. Multiple people are calling out the font on the back as being pretty rough, which is such a classic engineer move, right? Nail the incredibly complex fluid dynamic simulation, struggle with picking a good font. The creator's being super receptive to the feedback, though, actively asking for suggestions on better typefaces. There's also this hilarious comment where someone suggests that for true realism and lower cost, you could just make a thin water-filled box. Which, yeah, technically true, but where's the fun in that? Although they do have a point that the flip algorithm isn't being fully showcased here, since it's just sloshing around in a rectangular container. The algorithm can apparently handle way more complex scenarios, different viscosities, obstacle interactions, all sorts of wild physics behaviors that aren't really visible in this implementation. What really strikes me about projects like this is how they represent this shift in how technical people present themselves professionally. We've gone from paper resumes to GitHub profiles, and now we're seeing this emergence of physical computing as portfolio pieces. It's almost like business cards are becoming demo reels. And honestly, in a world where everyone's fighting for attention, handing someone a functioning computer that fits in their pocket is definitely one way to be memorable. The technical discussion in the comments gets pretty deep into the weeds, too. People are comparing different fluid simulation approaches, discussing power consumption optimizations, debating whether you could implement this on even cheaper hardware. It's this perfect storm of practical engineering and completely impractical application that makes the hacker community so entertaining. But speaking of running computations locally versus in the cloud, that brings us to our next story, which takes this idea of local computing to its absolute extreme. All right, so our next story really caught my attention because it goes completely against the grain of where tech has been heading. I want everything local, building my offline AI workspace. And this one sparked quite the debate with almost 1,000 points and over 260 comments on Hacker News. So here's what's fascinating. While everyone else is racing to the cloud, this developer basically said, nope, I'm going full hermit mode and built an entire AI workspace that runs completely offline. We're talking LLMs, code execution, browser automation, the whole 9 yards without a single byte leaving their machine. And honestly, the timing couldn't be more interesting given all the privacy concerns we've been seeing lately. The technical stack here is actually pretty clever. They're using Ollama to run language models locally on Apple Silicon, which, if you've got an M-series Mac, these chips are surprisingly capable for this kind of work. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of Docker for containerization, they went with Apple's container technology. Now, I'll admit I had to look this one up because it's not something you hear about every day. It's this lightweight VM isolation system that apparently plays nicer with macOS than Docker does for certain workloads. The whole setup includes Assistant.ui for the front end, a custom code runner for orchestration, and they even threw in Playwright for headless browser automation. So you could theoretically have your local AI browse the web for you, scrape data, fill out forms, all without any external services knowing what you're up to. What really drove this project home was the developers' mention of those early ChatGPT security issues. Remember when people were seeing other users' chat histories? Yeah, that was not great. And it really highlights why someone might want to keep their AI interactions completely private, especially if you're working with sensitive business data or, just don't want OpenAI knowing about your weird 3 a.m. coding questions. But here's where the community discussion gets really interesting and honestly pretty divided. On one side, you've got folks who are absolutely here for this privacy-first approach. They're talking about using it for photo editing, video processing, analyzing personal documents, all that stuff you might hesitate to upload to Claude or GPT-4. On the other hand, and this is where reality kind of crashes the party, the hardware requirements are brutal. We're talking about needing machines with massive amounts of unified RAM to run anything approaching the capability of cloud models. One commenter pointed out that to run an 80 billion parameter model properly, you're looking at a $2,000 plus investment minimum. And even then, you're getting maybe 10, 20 tokens per second, while services like Cerebras are pumping out over 1,000 tokens per second. There's this user, TC Dent, who basically called the whole local AI movement just a fun hobby instead of a viable strategy. And harsh as that sounds, they make some valid points. Your expensive hardware depreciates fast. The models you can run locally are always going to be inferior to what Google or OpenAI are serving up. And by the time you factor in electricity costs and your time, is it really more cost-effective than just paying for API access? But then you've got the counter-argument about data sovereignty and privacy. One interesting technical detail that came up was about RAG implementations. That's retrieval augmented generation, where you're searching through your personal data. Apparently, indexing all your emails and notes can balloon into 50-plus gigabytes of vector database storage, which there's this project called Lien claiming 97% storage reduction, which, if true, that's pretty impressive. The discussion also touched on something I think is really important: the user experience gap. Once you've experienced those blazing fast cloud services, going back to waiting 5 to 10 seconds for each response from a local model feels like going from fiber internet back to dial-up. It fundamentally changes how you interact with the AI. With fast responses, you can have actual conversations, iterate quickly on ideas. With slow local models, every query becomes this careful, considered thing because you don't want to waste time. What strikes me about this whole project and discussion is that it really crystallizes this tension we're seeing in tech right now. We've got incredible capabilities available through cloud services, but we're increasingly uncomfortable with the privacy trade-offs. This developer solution is admirably thorough. They've basically recreated a mini Google in their laptop, but the practical limitations mean it's more of a statement than a solution for most people. Still, though, I've got to respect the effort here. There's something almost punk rock about building your own completely offline AI setup in an era where everything wants to phone home. And who knows, maybe as hardware gets better and models get more efficient, this kind of setup will become more practical. Apple's already showing us what's possible with on-device AI processing, though of course they've got the advantage of controlling the entire stack from silicon up. You know, talking about computing power and what humans can achieve with limited resources, that actually brings me to our final story of the day. Because if you want to talk about doing the impossible with primitive computers, we need to talk about someone who literally flew to the moon with less processing power than that business card we started with. Here's a piece of trivia that came up in the discussion that I had no idea about. Lovell is the only person who flew to the moon twice without ever landing on it. Think about that for a second. Apollo 8, the first manned mission to leave Earth's orbit, and then Apollo 13, which, well, we all know how that turned out. Can you imagine the unique frustration and pride wrapped up in that distinction? Getting so close twice, seeing that lunar surface from just miles away and never setting foot on it? The discussion also touched on something sobering, the survival statistics of the moonwalkers. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, only 4 are still with us now. Buzz Aldrin from Apollo 11, David Scott from Apollo 15, Charles Duke from Apollo 16, and Harrison Schmitt from Apollo 17. When you realize we're down to just 4 living humans who've experienced standing on another celestial body, it really drives home how we're losing these direct links to one of humanity's greatest achievements. What struck me most in the comments was this interesting tension between acknowledging the Cold War politics that drove the space race and still finding genuine inspiration in what these people accomplished. One commenter pointed out, yeah, it was about beating the Soviets, it was about national prestige. But so what? The achievement stands on its own. These people strapped themselves to controlled explosions and flew to the moon with less computing power than what's in your smartphone right now. And speaking of computing power, several commenters brought up how Lovell's missions really showcase the importance of human judgment and problem solving in space. Apollo 13 especially, that wasn't solved by automation or AI. It was solved by humans on the ground and in space working through problems in real time, making literal life or death calculations with slide rules and pure ingenuity. There's this great detail someone mentioned about Lovell's cameo in the Apollo 13 movie. He plays the ship captain who shakes Tom Hanks' hand at the end. Apparently, Ron Howard wanted him to play a larger role, but Lovell insisted on just that small part. Even in Hollywood, the man stayed humble. You know what really gets me, though? One commenter said there should be a national day of mourning, and while that might seem excessive to some, I kind of get it. We put flags at half-staff for politicians and celebrities, but here's a man who literally helped expand the boundaries of human existence, who showed us what we're capable of when we push beyond what seems possible. The fact that NASA put out a statement, but it's not front-page news everywhere, it does feel like we're not quite giving these pioneers their due. The other thing that came through in the discussion was how Lovell never seemed bitter about not walking on the moon. Multiple people who met him mentioned this. He'd talk about his missions with pure joy and pride, no hint of what could have been. That takes a special kind of character to come that close to the ultimate achievement in your field twice and still be genuinely fulfilled by what you did accomplish. At 96 years old, Lovell lived long enough to see commercial spaceflight become reality, to see SpaceX land rockets on drone ships, to see plans for returning to the moon actually gaining momentum again. I wonder what he thought about all of it. Whether he felt like we'd lost our way after Apollo, or whether he saw it all as part of a longer journey he helped begin. And that's what I love about these three stories from yesterday's Hacker News. They're all about pushing boundaries in different ways. That business card, it's pushing the boundaries of what we expect from physical computing, turning a networking tool into a piece of interactive art. The offline AI workspace, that's pushing back against the assumption that all our computing has to happen in someone else's data center. And Jim Lovell, well, he literally pushed the boundaries of human exploration. In a way, they're all connected by this hacker spirit, this idea that the interesting stuff happens when you refuse to accept conventional limitations. Whether that's fitting a fluid simulation on a business card, running AI models on your laptop when everyone says you need the cloud, or flying to the moon with 1960s technology. That's what keeps me coming back to Hacker News every day. Out of those 30 stories that popped up yesterday, these three captured something essential about the community: the technical brilliance, the contrarian thinking, and the deep respect for those who came before us and showed us what's possible. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you're working on something that pushes boundaries, whether that's an over-engineered business card or your own moonshot, drop me a line. I'd love to hear about it. Until tomorrow, keep hacking, keep building, and keep questioning what's possible. This has been your Hacker News Daily. See you tomorrow.